God. Bad enough to have to look at me, but have to look at this at the same time. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here, and it's a really great honor. To be back in Ireland is always a great pleasure for me. I come back almost every year one way or another. Wouldn't have it any other way. But in particular, to talk to this group is, for me, a terrific pleasure, as well as an honor. And that's because I actually think that probably the most important aspect of our democracies internationally, Ireland in particular, is the work that community organizations do, the work that watchdog bodies do, the work that the sorts of movements that you in general represent here actually further. That's not made up for the occasion. I mean, as those of you who have been kind enough to read my book, Deirdre, of course, has just wet my powder, is that the expression, or stole my thunder, because she's sort of rehearsed a lot of the themes I'll talk about in the next 30 minutes or so. But in all of that work, as I say, it's not just for the occasion that I'm saying that community organizations, voluntary associations, activist groups are important. I've always believed that. I've come to believe it more and more strongly, and I think it fits very well with the larger Republican tradition as I think of it. So I just address two questions of me in the next half an hour. They're rather big questions, so it'll have to be somewhat swift, to say the least of it. The first question really is, what should community be doing? Our community, our society, our state, our political community, what should it be doing for its members, for its citizens? What is it that community is about? That's the first question. And then the second question is, how should community go about doing that? Well, in asking that first big question, you did invite a philosopher, so you got to expect this sort of stuff, I'm afraid. But in asking that first big question, well, actually, it's a question that interests all of us, isn't it? It's not the province or monopoly of philosophers as to what community should be doing for its citizens. One way of answering it, of course, is to go quite abstract and to say that, for example, it should be establishing a justice for all. I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say, or maybe welfare for all, or perhaps looking after people's rights. But one thing very striking about those sorts of formulations is those terms are very abstract, and they're essentially contested. I mean, everybody means what they want to mean, as it were, by justice, or by indeed rights for that matter. People's lists of rights vary enormously between individuals or between groups. Or again with welfare, what exactly does that consist in? These are multiply ambiguous terms. That's one problem about using them to define what it is we think community should be doing for people. I prefer to focus on freedom as the ideal, partly for a number of reasons. I mean, one reason is that freedom is the one value that we all think is really important. And it's been a value that's been important in, for example, European thinking right back to the Roman Republic. That's one reason. Another reason is that it's not multiply ambiguous, although, as I'll be trying to show you, it is ambiguous. But it's ambiguous only two ways. And it gives you, as it were, a choice to make between how you think about this ideal. And I want to suggest there's one way of thinking about the ideal that is really much more traditional, and I think much more productive and fertile as a way of thinking about freedom, especially from the point of view of people like you with your values which I deeply share. That's the one way that's really attractive, and the alternative, I think, as you think about it, is less attractive. Now, I'm not going to say very much about the alternative, though I could, but I would ruin your dinner. I'd ruin our time for enjoying the dinner. But I will say something briefly. So it's the classical liberal way of thinking about freedom. That's the way that I don't think is so profitable or fertile, though it has been very useful in various contexts in the past. But I think it's it's used up its shelf life. It's actually not all that old. The word liberal, for example, only gets invented about 1812 in Cadiz in southern Spain. It's adopted by a group, and then it becomes picked up as a word in English and comes to describe a new way, and it definitely was a new way, of thinking about freedom that had emerged about then. And in that liberal, classical liberal, I should really say, way of thinking, or indeed neoliberal, because neoliberal as it's used nowadays is very similar to classical liberal as it was used back about 1820, 1830 and so on. And on that way of thinking about freedom, freedom's essentially focused on choices. Basically, to have freedom in a society, what you want is a free-for-all where you maximize the choices that are available to people. This means that you focus essentially on the market as the arena, the means whereby choices magnify, and they do magnify and multiply and so on. And that was of course, the focus of people in the Industrial Revolution, that we were opening up all these new options for people with these industrial products and so on, ways of living, and enhanced modes of dealing with social and physical needs and so on. So the market is the great opener in this way of thinking. More and more choices, better and better and better. And on this way of thinking, to be free is, as Deirdre put it, not to be interfered with. So the less constraint you have, the better. And the argument was the market really removes and minimizes constraints. I mean, even the market in labor, so the idea went, after all, the laborer might end up, and that was certainly true in industrial times, alas, it's not ceased to be true today, but in industrial times it was certainly true that the regular laborer, working man or woman, worked under extraordinary conditions, and usually at the mercy, so to speak, of the master or owner, who could dismiss at will and often blacklist someone like that, basically destroying their life. And they lived, so to speak, under that threat always in that sort of relationship. But the argument of the classical liberals was, but they have freely contracted to enter into that relationship, and because they've freely agreed to enter the relationship, what happens within the relationship isn't really interference, or isn't anything to worry about, because freedom of contract, means that anything that happens under the contract is okay. They've freely opted into it. And this way of thinking, not only was the market, the maximal market, as you might put it, the natural home ground, so to speak, of freedom, but the state and the law was really questionable. Because after all, they pointed out, if freedom means not being interfered with, not being coerced, for example, then all law is coercive. So in fact, the state is actually, by contrast with the market, rather bad for freedom in this sense, because the state always takes away your freedom insofar as it coerces you in what you do. Of course, it may do more for freedom as non-interference in the long run. It may do more good for freedom in that sense than it does harm, because it may be that it stops other people, interfering with you. Of course, it does do that. And that the interference it practices itself is more than compensated for by the interference it stops. So that's very good. So the state does some good on this picture, but of course the state should be kept to an absolute minimum because of its constraining effect, and let the market boom, let choices multiply, open it up, have a free-for-all. That's the classical liberal sort of picture. There was room, by the way, in this picture, and I should say that, for not just market and law, but also for charity or philanthropy, as was described. That the role of, people like you, actually, is sort of remedial. It's to be there with your philanthropy to help out those who are falling on hard times as a result of the, rather cruel aspects of a free-for-all, of a competitive market. I mean, the law should provide for the absolute basic sort of necessity of people so that people don't actually die from starvation, although even that was put under pressure at times in the 19th century. But, that's certainly part of the orthodoxy, neoliberal orthodoxy. The law should provide, of course, a basic protection against the worst excesses of the market and against the worst effects of the market, but it should be minimized, basically. Okay, so that's the neoliberal sort of picture about freedom. So if you said, the main ideal in our society is that we should maximize freedom, freedom equally for all, of course, then you'd end up with a very competitive focus on the market and a diminished role for the state as a sort of night watchman state, the phrase often used, with philanthropy possibly filling in a lot of the gaps that the law left. A nice package. but a very harsh package in my view, not a package you can really identify with, and yet it's a package which is being sold to us, I think, all of the time. I mean, after all, it's been held within countries. For example, I live in the United States where it's now just almost orthodoxy, it's almost gospel, that of course a manager or an owner or whatever, a corporation, has the right to fire at will. Fire, that is to say, without any procedure, without any negotiation. Of course, you've got rid of unions, so there's no countervailing force on the part of those who are in employment. And so you're in a situation where people hang on in there, you know, and they obviously, it creates a competitive environment, all right. They're going to make their very best effort, but it's an environment in which, well, let me just stop there and now move to the other way of thinking about freedom. Okay, so that neoliberal way of thinking about freedom that focuses on choices, maximizing the scope of choice at whatever cost to individuals, as it were, the best will rise to the top is the image, the state is just a safety net, and philanthropy is remedial. By contrast with that way of thinking about freedom, you had an older way of thinking about freedom that actually, well, indeed it was at the center, for example, of Wolfe Tone's vision in the 1780s and 1790s when he almost single-handedly, well, with others of his period and time and mind, established what becomes known as the Irish Republican tradition. And that, of course, ended in the unsuccessful revolt in 1798. But one thing that's noticeable, striking about that revolt is that, well, there are a number of things. One is actually it was ecumenical. It involved Protestant, which referred to Anglican or Church of Ireland at the time, dissenter and Catholic, all together, very remarkably. That's one feature about it. Another feature is that it was, of course, won in a series of revolutions. It had just been preceded by the French, and before that by the American Revolution. And all of these revolutions identified with this longer Republican tradition. So they had a way of thinking about freedom that was really eclipsed by the classic liberal way that I've just described. So let me just tell you a little bit about how I think about that conception of freedom. It actually goes back to Republican Rome and the ideas, of freedom in Rome and of the institutions needed to provide freedom for the civis, the citizen, were passed on in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period in the Italian northern cities, which become republics that model themselves on Republican Rome. And then the ideas get passed on around Europe, and there's the Polish Republic, the Dutch Republic, the English Republic of the 1650s, 40s and 50s. And these ideas become, as many historians have said, almost common currency, a lingua franca, in the English-speaking world, as it happens, in the late 1600s and the 1700s. And it's those ideas that fuel Irish republicanism, among other things, and that fuel the American War of Independence and the French Revolution, as well as 98. So, actually, if you go to Tone, he left Ireland when, in 1791, he decided that actually you couldn't win Republican freedom for people in Ireland without breaking with London. That was for him a big break. He had up to then believed that you could achieve Republican freedom for all in Ireland, including Catholics, and that was actually something very distinctive about Irish republicanism that we should be, I think, proud of, is that it was the first major Republican movement that was decidedly ecumenical. Even the American Revolution, War of Independence, was very much focused on the dissenting groups and Protestant groups. Catholics were really, just barely tolerated. In fact, some people argue the American Revolution was partly sponsored by the fact that the American colonists were terrified that the English government would allow states in America, colonies in America, become, as they had allowed Quebec become, which is essentially a Catholic regime. In any case, that's what's striking about the Irish republicanism. But it shared with the other republicanisms and with that long tradition from Rome to the Renaissance to the 17th century revolts, it shared with them a particular understanding of freedom. Now, Tone, as I said, he left Ireland in 1791. He actually goes to America. In fact, he lives for a time within a couple of miles of where I live, in Princeton, New Jersey, although although with some other Irish teachers in Princeton we failed to identify where the actual house is, but it was somewhere in that region. And he writes many letters, but he uses various phrases in those letters that are helpful in thinking about the Republican way of thinking about freedom. He says, for example, in one letter, he says, Republicans detest the name of master. And here he's ringing a bell that's been ringing over many centuries. The idea is this: if you're free, then you can't have a master. You can't have a dominus, the Romans would have said, in your life. You can't suffer what the Romans actually called dominatio. And dominatio was what a slave suffered. Having a dominus, having a lord in his or her life, it's what a slave suffered. A Roman citizen, by contrast, did not suffer dominatio. And why not? Well, because the Roman citizen didn't have any master in private life, or the idea was in public life. Not in private life. Now, it was idealized, and I need to really add about all the faults in the Roman system, but this was the rosy picture that people took from Rome. The Roman citizen who enjoyed civitas, citizenship, was protected under the law against other citizens, so that no other citizen was a master in his, well, let me say his, I should say his or her, but in truth it was of course not, it didn't enfranchise women. The Roman citizen had no private master, the idea was, in his life. There was no one on whose will he depended for exercising what we think of as the personal or fundamental liberties, as they came to be called in the Republican tradition. The idea was law carved out for each person an area of choice, for each man, an area of choice where he could exercise his will as he wished, and without having to ask anybody else's permission, without having to depend on the grace or the favor of anybody else. So you had private sort of independence of others in this sphere. But the law that gave you that private independence was also a law that you shared with others in establishing. The law was established on your terms. That was the Roman ideal, because the law was established under a discipline in which people played a major role. Different sectors in the society played different roles. Those in the richer sectors, it's true, they belonged to the Senate. They were the ones who proposed laws and proposed those who would stand for office. You could only stand for office if you were of this elite class. But the ordinary people always elected the offices, and the ordinary people had to vote in favor of the laws. And what's more, when the laws were in place, how they applied was determined by juries, which were composed of often up to 200 ordinary people. It wasn't a judge or a jury like we have. And furthermore, how the laws were always responsive to whether or not the ordinary people were going to be upset by them, were going to protest against them, or going to gather in the forum, which is just outside the Senate House, for example. So all laws were established in a sort of dialogue, you might say, although that's probably too pretty a word, is certainly in an interaction with the citizenry of Rome. And the idea was that actually the word in Latin that was used in the Roman law that was used for the status of a citizen was that every citizen was, they said, sui juris. That means of his own jurisdiction, means lives on his own terms. And the idea was the civis, the citizen, lived on his own terms in his private life, how he did things, but equally the laws that were established on the terms that the people shared or combined in imposing on government or the law. So you were both equal by the law or before the law or under the law, and you were equal over the law. That was the image. Now that notion of freedom, it gets associated from very early on with the idea of the citizen, the civis, can walk tall, doesn't have to beg anyone else's favor. It doesn't have to be in fear of anybody else. Of course, this is an ideal. It's not always like that in Rome, I hasten to say, and certainly not like that for women or for slaves, but it becomes an ideal of what a free person is. And that gets picked up very strongly in the Renaissance period, but even more so in the 17th century, the 18th century, in the century of tone and of Irish republicanism. And you'll know all the English phrases because it becomes a very English language tradition, actually. The phrases are, you're not free if you have to bow and scrape. You're not free if you have to bend the knee. if you have to doff the cap or tug the forelock, if you have one, then you're not free. That shows that you're having to, so to speak, keep a master free. And that's a sure sign that you are living under a master. Maybe not a legal master, maybe not someone who in law is a master, but you're living in the, so to speak, shadow of someone who, if they wish, can interfere with you. And that's enough to mean that you are unfree. You don't actually have to be interfered with. The fact that someone can interfere with you and that you live at their mercy, so to speak, that you are inclined to fawn and to toady and to kowtow in order to maintain the fact that they don't interfere with you, that itself means that you're unfree. And in this way of thinking, the free person, the free man, and it does get extended, for example, in the work of Mary Wollstonecraft in the 1790s, it gets extended to women and becomes an ideal for women as well, that every citizen should be able to walk tall. And Deirdre quoted what I think of as the eyeball test of whether you're free or not. Look others in the eye without reason for fear or for deference, right? You're their equal. Okay, that image becomes absolutely cemented in the tradition. That's what the republic comes to mean. The idea of a republic is it's a community where there isn't an absolute king, for example, who can do as he wishes with you, where there aren't divisions between aristocrats and commoners, between landlords in this country, for example, and regular peasants, such that some have to bend the knee, bow and scrape to others, a situation in which the ideal is everyone can, as it were, have ground of his own on which, or her own on which to stand. It sounds a bit harsh, doesn't it? The idea that everyone is sort of this independent center of power in their own lives, sharing in exercising power over the law, so they're not dominated by the law either. But actually, it's not harsh because, of course, from positions of power like that, people can reach out to one another in friendship and in love and make, agreements with one another that make them dependent on one another, but they do it voluntarily. Love is a voluntary or free assumption of dependency on another person, and it actually presupposes the sort of independence, I would say, that's hailed in this Republican notion of freedom. Often, and in the book that Deirdre nicely mentioned, in order to make really quite vivid what this image of freedom is, I use an example from Henrik Ibsen's play, A Doll's House. You remember in A Doll's House, the couple are Torvald, the man, a young banker living in Oslo, quite well off, and his wife Nora. And they're living at a time where Torvald has all the power. He's the legal power. His wife is basically totally dependent on him. Even though she brings some money into the marriage, for example, he has total disposal of those assets, and she totally depends on him for her use of the assets. And equally, of course, she's dependent on him for whether or not he allows her, go to various gatherings, associate with various people, write a letter to the newspaper, She's totally dependent on his allowing her do that. Of course, Torvald is absolutely in love with her. He worships the ground she walks on. He gives her carte blanche when it comes to doing those things. So Nora has absolutely no restraint at all actually imposed on her. In fact, the only restraint he does say, if I remember, he doesn't want her to eat macaroons, isn't it? But even though that's not a restraint, because she hides the macaroons in her skirts, right? So she really can do anything she wants within, normal range. Is she free? Well, the interesting thing, on the neoliberal way of thinking about freedom, of course she's free. She's entered this by contract, first of all. So even if she was bullied, she contracted into it. But in any case, she's not interfered with in a whole range of ways. Man, she's got it made, She's really got freedom as non-interference. But she does not have freedom as non-domination. She's not in a position where she can look Torvald in the eye without reason for fear or favor. Actually, Torvald, in my image of it, could even have resented this himself, because he might want her to be independent, to be free, to be able to look her in the eye. But the truth is that he doesn't know that his will won't change, and if his will towards her changed, if he became, for example, less enamored of her, then of course she is going to suffer that, because he presumably will then be more intrusive, and he might not want that to happen, but there's nothing he can do about it. But if he had a law or a culture that backed up Nora, for example, in the sense that it became unthinkable and perhaps even illegal that he should throw his weight around within the marriage, then she could look him in the eye and he could look her in the eye and not feel, there would be a possibility actually of love. Suppose we take that way of thinking about freedom as an ideal. What does this mean in terms of policy? Well, I think it means three things, and I'm going to say them very briefly, and they're probably going to come across as very pat, and I can't really make them vivid in the time available, but the three things it means is this. It's bound to mean is this. First of all, if you're going to have it as an ideal, then people in your community or society should enjoy personal independence. They should enjoy, for example, social security, because if you don't have that, then you're absolutely going to be dependent on other people and their goodwill and their philanthropy. And they should enjoy legal security, as in proper legal assistance in the event that's really crucial, medical security. A whole range of legally assured securities of this kind are going to be absolutely essential, so that in private relationships with other individuals, but equally with corporations, with corporate bodies or associations or churches, they are not in a position of having to depend on even the goodwill of those other individuals or people. That's the first, personal freedom. But the second is, obviously, you've got to live in a society where the law that establishes what your basic liberties are, what the sphere is in which you're going to be protected by the law, that law itself should be subject to you and your fellow citizens equally, so that electorally and by other means, we'll come to that in just a moment, you should be able to feel that this is our law, this is the people's law, this is a law that is established on our terms, and not under the influence of special elites, certainly not under the influence of an absolutist king. Of course, that's why republicanism is always associated with anti-monarchism, that the very epitome of a power behind the law that imposes the law on you, regardless of your will, is the absolute monarch. But of course, once the monarch becomes constitutionally insulated, so to speak, and is essentially ceremonial, at that point, monarchy just isn't a problem for this Republican vision. By the way, that was shared also by, for example, by Tone. Tone wrote in the early 1780s as a radical Whig, which meant someone who belonged to this tradition of thinking. At the time, it was called more the Commonwealthsman way of thinking rather than the Republican. That sounded, better in England of the time. The other did sound a bit anti-monarchical. The Commonwealth way of thinking were also called radical Whigs. He identifies as that, and of course, he doesn't mind the fact that there's a king in England if within Ireland you can still establish, both private liberty for people and have the law that's imposed on Ireland be imposed on the people's terms via the Dublin Parliament, which actually was given in 1782 more independence than it used to have. Of course, Catholics, dissenters were allowed into that Parliament in 1782 with Protestants, but Catholics weren't, and that was Tone. He was himself a Protestant, but that was Tone's great problem, that he felt you could never persuade the English government at the time to actually enfranchise Catholics. But anyhow, so those are two aspects of what you need. You need a community where people are privately not dominated and are publicly not dominated. But you also need a community that isn't dominated from the outside. I mean, that was the great complaint of the Americans, that they were dominated from the outside. Actually, an interesting thing, 1765, the British impose the Stamp Act on the Americans. The Americans hate it, they say remove it, and Westminster does remove it. But in removing it in 1766, they introduced something called the Declaratory Act, in which they say, look, we're repealing this tax and this law, but we assert the right and the power and the authority to impose such laws if we wish on the Americans. That's what got up the Americans' nose, right? The fact that, not the fact that the British were being terribly intrusive, they weren't, but that they were claiming the right to intrude if they wished. They were claiming the position of a master, albeit a kindly or a gentle master. Okay, so those are the three things that you'd expect in a community where people are to enjoy freedom as non-domination, you'd expect to happen. One, private protection and empowerment of individuals against private domination. Secondly, protection democratically and otherwise against public. And furthermore, that the country as a whole is not subject to outside powers that dictate the sort of laws that will be passed within the country. Now, how might we think of achieving those very high ends? I mean, I like this Republican way, this neo-republican way. Neo, because of course you extend it to all citizens, men and women, all basically adult, able-minded, more or less permanent residents of a society can count for these purposes as citizens. You extend that, this ideal. It gives you a nice sort of view about what government should be doing, you know? It's not just a dog's breakfast, as some policy packages seem to me to be, with this thrown in and that thrown in. And it's really, it gives us a possibility of opposing what I think of as neoliberalism with a coherent alternative, with this long tradition. But how to achieve the ends of the kinds that I'm talking about? Well, on the private front, obviously you need a law, and the securities law can give. But they're not got to be worth anything unless you've also got, and I come back to the theme I began with, unless you've got voluntary associations of people that continually monitor what government are doing, that serve as watchdogs on what the laws are being introduced, how they're working, whether they're working, and that serve, of course, as a backup, for people to enjoy that sort of freedom as non-domination. Let me give you two examples. I mean, you can have the law, for example, may do a lot for the position of employees in relation to employers. My own belief is in the absence of unions or of something that will play the role. Now, I know unions are not very popular in Dublin at the moment because of Lewis, but there's no such thing as a perfect institution, and while unions certainly, and I'm not saying anything about the present strike, but while unions certainly have been guilty, I would say, of abuses in the past, so have the corporate side been guilty of abuses, and I'd prefer have the two powers, balance one another than remove one and leave the field entirely in the play of corporations. But I think in order to have workers in a position where they really can look their masters in the eye, equally free with them, albeit not as rich or whatever they might be, not as influential and so on, you're going to have voluntary associations, people willing to back up the individual worker rather than just the law alone. And that's really such a role, important role for organizations like the Wheel represents or embodies. Secondly, when it comes to democracy isn't just about elections whereby we change those in government. What's really important is that you've got a democracy that has a contestatory aspect, where people are involved. This is an old Republican idea. Machiavelli said about Rome, its great secret was that the plebs, the poor people, were always ready out there in the forum to challenge how the law was going or what the Senate were proposing if it really didn't seem to wash, it didn't seem to answer to their interests. What we need in a society today is no one single individual can be civically virtuous and be able to invigilate or look at everything, what's happening on all sides of government and contest it and challenge it. You have to divide up civic labor. And different bodies have got to play that role of invigilating government, of keeping eyes on government. It was an Irishman, John Phillip Kern, in the 1780s or 90s, who said, not Thomas Jefferson, Kern was the first, a contemporary of Tones, who said the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And you represent, in a way, or organizations of the kind that you represent, are these focuses that are essential of vigilance and contestation, of opposition, of bringing things into public light in order to make sure that what's happening in government under the law is indeed happening on the people's terms, is satisfying standards that are accepted across the community as a whole. So the government is disciplined. It's not allowed, so to speak, to go its own way. And we know there have been huge failures. I mean, financial regulation in this country clearly just fell by the wayside in the period of the Celtic Tide. I don't think I'm saying anything very controversial when I say that, going on at least the stuff that I read. And how are you going to get financial regulation? Well, you have to have official regulators, very good, but you have to have watchdog bodies. You have to have civic organizations and so on ready to keep, pressing the question, throwing the spotlight. Let me just mention, take Volkswagen, one of a great abuse. It was a private organization, a voluntary organization that blew the whistle first on Volkswagen. an English, if I remember, an English organization. It just shows you how important, all the official regulators across Europe, across America, they'd failed to detect this terrible abuse that a single company, in the name of company profits, was imposing on people. Absolutely not on and the regulators and so on didn't work, except as a result of these voluntary associations. Democracy, as I see it, and we're talking about the second dimension of Republican freedom, it requires a sort of pincer movement. You need elections, of course, and they cement in freedom of association and speech and so on, but you also need the other leg of the pincer, which is groups like yours that are continually keeping government in view, challenging government, and backing up, so to speak, the law where it needs to be backed up. For example, take the case of law can introduce laws against domestic abuse, for example. But they're not going to be worth anything, really, unless there's women's movements that are ready to back up women, for example, who are abused, their battered homes and so on, where there are women, and are not necessarily women, but people from the society who are prepared to back up women in a position like that, not to let them just, so to speak, be protected by the law. The law is not going to be enough. Okay, the third dimension, and I'll just finish very briefly on this, of freedom is, of course, the freedom of a community in relation to other communities. I think there are two main aspects for that in Ireland today. One is in relation to multinational enterprises. Each enterprise nowadays comprises mini corporations, shell corporations. It's a massively complex thing. You take someone like Google or Apple, and these companies, it seems to me, shocking, can manage to persuade the Irish government to pay almost no tax whatsoever, at least in the honeymoon period, and then only to pay 12.5% tax. I mean, that seems to me what's happening is a corporation like that, and it's doing, of course, with every country what it's doing like Ireland, what they're doing like with Ireland, which is letting countries play off against one another to beat down company tax levels, and perhaps also, in many cases, to loosen up environmental regulations or workplace relationship laws, for example. And the power of corporations is going to be enormous under these new trade agreements that give corporations the power to take a country to a tribunal, usually a tribunal manned by international lawyers, themselves dependent on international companies for their employment, to determine whether or not the country has, with some, say, democratically introduced legislation, worsened the terms of trade for that corporation under the trade agreement, in which case the country can actually be forced to pull back the legislation in order to answer to the interests of the company. That seems to me utterly crazy, that we give international bodies like these corporations that sort of power. We've got to, as a community, work against that. Myself, I have a very harsh view of what's happened under the Eurozone. It seems to me that we were absolutely trampled upon as a community when the ECB, basically told the Irish government, we're going to deny you liquidity unless you buy out the Irish banks. And in other words, ensure that none of the French or German banks or the international bondholders invested in the Irish banks lose a penny. Now, those people had invested in Irish banks. They assumed the risk. And what the ECB, our central bank, was saying, our government was, you have got to make the Irish taxpayer pay so that these bondholders don't have to pay a penny. I know that's a shortened version of the story, and no doubt it's a slanted one, but it seems to me that's how it was. And that's a straight case of where we bought ourselves into an arrangement with the Eurozone, where essentially we are dominated as a community by the Eurozone community. Now, I don't think the end of the story, but we as a community have got to keep pushing our government. We've got to be mad as hell, in order to make sure that we don't go quietly, so to speak, into submission to that sort of arrangement. Anyhow, so this notion of freedoms, I think, look others in the eye without reason for fear or deference. It gives you an ideal for private liberty, personal liberty, for our liberty as a community in relation to government, and for our freedom as a community in relation to other communities or to international bodies like corporations. So I sort of recommend it to you. I think that it's in our DNA, this Republican tradition, as it's in the DNA of many countries, many cultures. And I think it really does give us a sort of moral compass, and it gives us an alternative to the neoliberal vision. So thanks very much.